You know, there's lots of things that we're not doing that we could do that you also touch on. One of the things that strikes me as somewhat catastrophic is the tragic underdevelopment of nuclear power. I've spoken with a number of people about the possibilities of nuclear power, and you point out in your, I think it's in How Innovation Works actually, that there are no shortage of plans for much smaller nuclear reactors that don't use water as the primary coolant, that use salt or some other substance like that, certain salts, and that if they fail, they actually shut down rather than melting down. And so that's another example, I think, of where the environmentalists, which a broad brush, but the environmentalists got things seriously wrong and are still doing so, because as far as I can tell, if you wanted, the question is, what do you want? Like, if you want cheap power of the sort that would make people rich enough to start caring about the environment, it seems to me that you would be a nuclear power supporter rather than a supporter of solar or wind power, which I think only still accounts for about 3% of total energy needs.
That's true. People say, oh, no, that's wrong. It's more than 10%. And you find they're referring to electricity, but electricity is only about 25% of energy at the moment. So it's around 3% comes from solar and wind. But the real problem with solar and wind versus nuclear is still horribly expensive because of the way we've regulated it and driven up its price. So our problem is how to get the price down. But the real problem is the amount of land that solar and wind use, because they're very low density sources of energy. So you have to have a lot of land, and you need more land than there is. You know, I mean, even Canada has hardly got enough land to produce renewable energy for its population. Frankly, that's going back to a medieval economy where you had to use the landscape to produce energy. You had to dam the rivers and grow the crops that you then and cut down the forests, you know, to burn for wood. Well,
it's not obvious either that wind farms aren't a blight on the landscape.
I'm afraid they are. They're terrible for birds. I'm a keen bird watcher. I don't like the idea of these birds being devastated by onshore and offshore wind. And, you know, a wind farm spends the first 7-8 years of its life earning back the energy that went into building the wind turbine. You know, and only after that is it net positive. Even then, it's a huge investment of capital that could be doing something else. You know, the point about energy is that it's the master resource. It's the thing that everybody else needs to use. So you want to make it as cheap and as reliable as possible.
Yes, exactly. And that should be said over and over, that if you were, it seems to me that if you were truly concerned about the planetary fate, let's say, or even more precisely, the fate of the people on the planet, that you would do everything you could to drive the cost of energy, including the externalized costs, to something as low as possible, because it's the prerequisite for everything else. And starving people aren't, we already talked about this, but starving people aren't good planetary stewards. So even if
you'll notice, Jordan, you and I have now slipped into a slightly pessimistic mood in that we're finding the energy policies of our countries rather stupid.
Yeah, it's probably because we're old enough so that a 90-minute discussion starts to become tiring.
Well, there's that, but also, you know, the identity politics stuff, the anti-enlightenment mood of our times. I can make a case that we might just be about to kill the goose that has been laying these golden eggs.
Well, I truly think we should avoid going there. And I've thought about this a lot, watching people respond, for example, to some of the things that I've been talking about over the last few years. You know, there's a huge population of young and not so young people out there who are literally starving. No, they're metaphorically starving. They're psychologically starving for a positive but believable story. And I think that, like, as you pointed out, we could decry the state of modern politics and concern ourselves with the fact that counterproductive economic and social policies might be put in place for all sorts of ideological reasons. But I actually think a much better use of our time is in the kind of enterprise that you've already pursued, which is to produce a robust counter-narrative that's thoroughly grounded in, to the degree that that's possible, thoroughly grounded in the facts. We can say, look, forget about that. Forget about the pessimism. Forget about the policies that pessimism would drive. We could make the assumption that we can have our cake and eat it too. We can eradicate poverty. We can constrain relative inequality to the point where societies are stable. And we can produce a massive increment in environmental quality. And all that's within our grasp if that's what we want within the next 100 years. And
absolutely.
And I mean, you've devoted the last 30 years of your life at least to exactly that message, and I think that's a much more powerful solution than being pessimistic about the counter positions. People need a better story.
Right. You're dead right. Thank you for reminding me that that's what I think.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's easy to get tangled up, because and politics, especially moment-to-moment politics, can tangle you up badly and knock you off your central axis. And your work. This is probably a good place to end too. Your work is refreshing in that regard. There's other people who are doing this sort of thing too, like Bjorn Lomborg, for example, and Hans Rosling, who are and Marion Tupy, who are informed optimists.
Yeah, both Bjorn and Hans were huge influences on me, and very sadly, Hans Rosling's no longer with us. But it was a true. Bjorn's book was a true eye opener to me. It was about the same time I was starting to think along the same lines, and
an eye opener to him too.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that would be a good place to leave it. And we could say, look, to the people who are listening to this, there's no reason for a counterproductive and anti-human pessimism. We could have a planet where there was enough for everyone, and where there was enough for the non-human inhabitants too, that contribute to making life rich. And there's no reason not to aim for that, and there's absolutely no reason not to assume that it's within our grasp. So we want to aim properly, and we can have what everyone seems to want, whether they're on the right or the left, when they're thinking properly, which is an eradication of absolute poverty, so no one is forced into penury and starvation, and no children fail to develop. We can reduce the impact of relative poverty, which is an intransigent problem, but not unaddressable. And we could restore, to a large degree, or maintain a sustainable ecology around us. And we don't want to forget that and drown in our threat sensitivity.
Yeah. But we do it by development, not by anti-development.
Yeah, we do that by faith in human by faith in human beings, fundamentally. And I think that faith, I don't think there's any reason for that faith to be unwarranted. We're not a plague on the planet. There's no reason to assume that.